today's training is essentially a session on Designer. And at this point, we're going to go through a few workflows, but this is a training for you guys. So I want you to be as comfortable as possible with Designer. So if you have questions, feel free to shout them out at any given time. Hopefully this will take 45 to 60 minutes or so, depending on the number of questions we get. So to kick it off, a few things. Hopefully everyone's seeing my screen here. To kick it off, I have a number of Shure products connected to my system. So at this point, I have IMX Room is associated with my computer, and I'm going to come in here and I'm actually going to factory reset this because it looks like I didn't do that. But you'll see all of the hardware that's associated with my computer offers this new warning, which is telling me that I need to initialize my devices to configure. So we're going to go through that process, but because that is new with the 4.1 firmware, we're going to factory default all of our Shure gear. And again, we're kind of recommending MXA 310, 910, P300, and IMX Room for this training. Minimally, I think you could get by with IMX Room and MXA 910, and we'll kind of go through that whole process there. So in addition, I have downloaded the latest and greatest version of Designer, which is version 4.1.0, build 3408. So you should be running that. If you're updating or your customer's updating from a previous version of Designer, we recommend that you export all of your projects and templates and save them locally before updating, just in case they don't automatically populate when you do update. When I updated, all of my projects and templates came up automatically. So I didn't have that issue, but it's important if someone is going to update Designer for the first time, they should be saving that documentation locally so they don't lose it. A few other things to note before I get started with the training. I have also Dante controller. I've got the latest version downloaded on my computer. I also have Shure's update utility and web device discovery. So I have a number of different programs here that we'll go through or will use as I go through this training. I also have on a notepad, you could use a Word doc, my license ID for IntelliMix Room. So I can refer to that when we go through the process of actually adding that to a project. I also have a conference room image that I'm going to use for the design process. And last but not least, again, I factory default all that Shure gear. IntelliMix Room is downloaded and installed on a NUC that is running in addition to my MacBook right now. So I'm running parallels with my Designer instance. And then my IMX Room is running on a NUC. And at the end of the session, we'll be able to do a quick live demo. I've pre-selected IMX Room as my audio device of choice at this time within BlueJeans, but it would be whatever your kind of app of choice is. So the next step is really to kind of talk about what's new with the 4.1 software. So of course with Designer 4.1, we're finally able to support the new IMX Room audio processing software. And you'll see this is version 1.0.4. So this is supported with Designer 4.1. We also are supporting all of the 4.1.x firmware for P300, MXA 910, MXA 310, and ANI USB. The things that are not supported, and this is sort of for your info, at this time ANI 4, ANI 22, MXW, and SCM 820 are not supported. You'll see that we also talked a little bit about this Initialized Devices. This is something new that's with the 4.1 firmware for our Shure devices as well. So anytime we initially connect to a device, it's going to ask us to create a password or to bypass the password creation, and we're going to talk through that process as well. So I think at this point, we kind of talked through the software that's needed, the hardware that's needed, factory default, everything, and now we can jump into the actual training of Designer itself. So there's two main workflows that we're going to outline today. The first being design mode, where we are basically creating these system designs, pre-configuring our rooms with virtual devices. The second workflow is that live mode. So that's that real-time room setup where we're using Designer as our sort of centralized platform to configure and deploy all of our Shure network product. So before we get started, this is Designer. Welcome to your Designer workspace. You'll see on the left-hand side, there's a number of menu bars. While there is a menu bar at the top of the screen here, you'll see the File, Edit, View, Window Help. The main tabs that you're going to work with in Designer are on this left-hand side of the screen under my name. So we have Projects. We also have a Templates area. Online Devices will again populate that window with any device that that Designer basically sees. We also have an Event Log tab. Real quick, you can export this log. It saves it as a Excel file. So should you be having any issues, you can come in here at any time and kind of export that and send that to Shure support. It's not something I've ever had to use, but should you need it, it's there. The last tab on this left-hand side is the Settings tab. And super important, in my opinion, is this network setup, much like with the Update Utility app and Web Device Discovery app. You do need to properly select the right NIC in order to access your devices. So at the very bottom of my screen here on the left-hand side, you'll see I have 4 devices online. If I was not seeing those devices, this is where I would need to come to the network setup on my Settings tab to select that proper NIC. I'm going to go back to the Projects tab. You'll see on these pages for projects and templates, there's a search field at the top, so you can enter any search terms you'd like. And all the way on the right-hand side of the screen, towards the top, is the help function. So this will offer you a number of topics that are relevant to the page that you're currently on in Designer. You can also click this help function, and this will open the entire help file, and you have a link as well to the online user guide. So help is there should you need it. So at this point, we've talked a little bit about the Designer workflow, the workspace itself. Let's jump into the workflow. So we're going to create a project offline. And to do that, Designer is very location or project centric. So I'm on the My Projects tab, and I'm going to click the New. And you'll see here I have 2 options. So I can create a new project, or I can import a project. Import would give you the ability to bring in, say, for example, someone else's Designer file, should they share that with you. For the sake of this example, we're going to just create a new project, so I'm just going to click Project. And the window that populates will allow me to create a new project. And I'm going to call this Shure's Niles Campus. Hopefully I can spell. And at this point, I could add a description. I'm not going to for this example, and I'm going to click Create here at the bottom of this box. So now that I've named my project Niles Campus, you'll see that I need to create a location in order to configure the devices in that particular location. So to do that, again, we have this new button here at the top under Location. I'm going to create a new location. Before I do that, just know that there are folders available. So if you had the need to organize multiple locations by any characteristics, say building number, floor number, for example, you could do that with that folder tab. We will create simply a new location by clicking Location. And a location is essentially a room. So we're going to call this Building A, Room 101. Again, description field should you need it. And then I'm just going to click Create. And automatically I have a window populated that I'm going to maximize. And you'll see at the very top of this, I do have the name of my location, which is, again, Building A, Room 101, top left-hand corner. On the right-hand side of the page, you have your Properties tab, and you'll, again, see the name of my location. I can edit that if I'd like to. I could add a description if I'd like to, but we're going to move forward with the design. So this blue-gray area here with the dotted line is essentially where we're going to add devices that we're going to bring into this particular location. You'll see on the left-hand side under the overview area, we have a number of virtual devices that we can work with. Again, these are the Shure kind of systems, components that we're going to be working with in Designer at this time. So we're here on this overview tab. We can, of course, access other tabs as we move through the design. But to begin, we definitely need to add some products to our workspace. So I know I want the best ceiling microphone in the world, so I'm going to drag over the MXA910. And I know that in this particular instance, while the P300 is great, I'm going to want to use IMX Room on a nook in my room. So I'm just going to pick that device and just simply drop it into that workspace. Anytime I choose IMX Room and bring it into a workspace, Designer is going to prompt me to select the proper channel allocation that I've purchased. In this case, I purchased 16 channel license, so I'm just going to click Next. You can, of course, select either of those options for your project. So at this point, we have a microphone and we have a processor in our workspace, and we're ready to move forward with designing this project. I'm going to move to the Coverage Map tab here at the top of the screen, and I'm simply going to click that. And at this point, this should look familiar. So this is where we can bring in a conference room image, and we can deploy our MXA910 and make some adjustments to the lobe layout. So I'm going to click this Add Image again on the Coverage Map tab at the top of the screen above my virtual devices. And I'm going to bring in a conference room layout. And as soon as I do that, Designer is going to prompt me to scale this image. So I'm going to select the door frame because I know this is about 3 feet. I will type 3, and then I'm going to click the check mark in the right-hand side of this box. So Designer at this point has just scaled this image for me. Automatically click off here into the right-hand side of Designer, and then you can use the zoom out and in, select your crayon there to open up your workspace. And you should really only do this once. And then I'm just going to click Fit again. So at this point, a few things to note. All the way over here on the right-hand side of the screen under Properties, you'll see that Designer has scaled my workspace based on that scale that I set. So I have my length and I have my width set by Designer. I also have the ability to come in here and change my ceiling height. So in this particular example, my ceiling height is 10 feet. So I'm going to type 10 and I'm going to hit Enter. And you'll see that here in this yellow crayon at the top of my conference room image, it has updated my workspace height. So now my room height is 10 feet. The next step is to select my MXA910 by just clicking the 910 and bring it into my workspace. And boy, oh boy, that's a lot of lobes, right? We don't want to overlobe our conference space. So I'm going to start removing a few lobes, and I'm just going to very quickly position these guys so that I can get started with my design. Should I have a really large conference space and need to bring in an additional MXA910, over here on the left-hand side where you see virtual devices, I could always drag this in and then again begin to deploy that second MXA910 in my conference space. Since I have a smaller conference space today, I'm going to select this and I will use this trash can here to delete that second MXA910. When you're deleting lobes on the workspace, you can simply use your delete key. You can also use this trash can up here at the top above virtual images. If I take away too many lobes, I can always add back a channel, again, at the top above virtual devices on the left-hand side of the screen. Great, so at this point, we have adjusted our lobes for the MXA910. Let's come over here to the right-hand side under Properties, and you'll see that I have a device section that I can use this arrow to open up. I want to point out two things here. One is height and the second is rotation. So the first thing with regards to height, you'll recall that we set our conference space to a 10-foot ceiling height. At this point, our array is mounted at 9 feet. I can change this by entering any number in this field, and I can use the plus and minus buttons here to make additional adjustments. Anytime you make changes and you type in anything into that field, you must hit enter or return to get that to stay. Of course, if I want to enter 11 feet, it's not possible. That's because we've already scaled our workspace to 10 feet. So it must be 10 or below. So let's choose 10. One other thing that I'd like to point out is rotation. So often it's important to change the rotation of the array based on how it will be installed. You can use the rotation field on the right-hand side under Properties to type in any value. You can also use the plus-minus fields, or you can come in, select the array, hold the Shift key, and rotate the orientation of that particular array. So just a few things that you can do to kind of customize your deployment of the MXA910 in that particular workspace. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to update the name of this particular device for my project. So on the right-hand side under Properties, I'm going to change my device name, and I'm going to call this MXA910-Room 101, and I'm going to hit Enter. Keep in mind you cannot have any spaces when you are typing a device name. So again, type in the name and hit Enter. So at this point, I feel pretty confident in my coverage map. We've brought in our conference room layout. We have adjusted our ceiling height in this particular room. We've scaled our image. We've added our MXA910, adjusted our lobe deployment, adjusted the height, and adjusted the rotation of this particular array. And we can move on to the next tab, which is here at the top in that signal flow. So I'm just going to click Signal Flow. And you'll see I have the devices that I've added to my project. On the Signal Flow tab, I can route the audio between my Shure devices. There's an auto route functionality on the left-hand side, right above the virtual devices. And if I click that, it's going to open up a box that's going to prompt me to select my microphone and my processor. To do so, I'm simply going to click my MXA910 once, same with my processor, and you'll see that information is populated in that box. I will click Route, and very quickly, Designer has established audio and Dante routes between my Shure devices. One super important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about these devices, there is an AEC reference in on the MXA910. Strongly recommend sending a reference from your processor of choice. This will help with optimization of the autofocus performance. So I'm going to make that route manually by simply clicking on that number 1 AEC reference in, and I'm just going to connect that to my processor. So at this point, we've routed our audio, we've added that AEC reference in, and the next step would be to optimize our audio. So if I click Optimize Audio, I have a window here that prompts me to configure, cancel, or I can open up this list of change settings. And for the sake of this training, let's open that up, and you'll see that the Optimize option essentially allows you to put your processor and microphone in the best spot in terms of being able to work with each other. So all the way here on the right-hand side, you'll see IntelliMix Room with the MXA910. You'll see a number of EQ and gain settings that will be pushed with the press of that one Optimize button. So instead of going through manually and enabling kind of the Shure starting points for these devices, I'm going to click out of this box. And again, we're still in that Optimize Audio option. I'm going to click Configure. And very quickly, Designer has optimized my devices to work with each other. One final thing I'll do on this tab is I like consistency. So I'm going to come in here on the right-hand side of the screen, and I'm going to change the name of my IMX Room instance to Room 101. So again, on this Signal Flow tab, we've been able to route our audio between our Shure devices. We've made a manual route for the AEC reference in on that MXA910. We've optimized our audio, and we've adjusted the name of our IMX Room. Stepping back at the top to the Coverage Map tab. Just to review, we've added our conference room layout, we've adjusted our MXA 910 positioning, adjusted our lobes, we've talked a little bit about ceiling height versus device height, as well as the rotation of the array. And if I go back to my Overview tab, at this point, we have successfully configured our configuration for room 101, and we're done with this offline design. So I'm going to close out of this tab. If I click back to my projects on the left-hand side, I have the ability to export this document. So if I wanted to share this with maybe Michael Cooley or somebody and have them kind of review my design, I could export and save that as an attachment on an email and send that away. At this point, we're going to start talking about the second workflow in Designer. And that second workflow is, how do we attach online devices to an existing design? So you'll recall that we have a number of devices online currently. So we have our IMX room, our 310, our 910, and our P300. Again, with the 4.1 software, we're always going to see this initialization prompt in Designer. If I open up the web interface for my P300, I'm just going to copy the IP address so it's quicker. We will see that same initialization on an internet browser for the P300. So the same information that we're seeing to initialize that device, again, is seen on that browser interface. So the browser will prompt us to continue without a password or set up a password, as will Designer. And that initialization is essentially just a handshake between the devices and Designer, or the online browser interface. Since we are talking about Designer workflow, today we're going to come into Designer. I'm going to select all these devices by using this box at the top, and you'll see they're all selected. And I'm going to use the initialization through Designer. So let's click Initialize the Devices. And Designer is going to tell me that we're going to put these devices in a ready state so that we can begin configuring them. I'll click Initialize. And at this point, that warning is gone. Designer will prompt us to add them to a location and to set up a password. At this point, we'll just click OK. If I return to my browser interface, I'm going to open up a new tab, and I'll enter that IP address. You will see that the browser no longer asks me to set up a password or to continue. So that initialization that we just did in Designer has initialized that device to be used with Designer as well as the browser interface. You'll also see this warning here. If it's a warning, but it's a message that's telling you you must use Designer for full configuration. This is the browser interface for P300. Essentially, you have a settings tab of information that you can work through. So you have your general information. If I move to the network tab, you'll see that I have my IP address info. I have a firmware tab, which reads out the current firmware of that device. I also have my audio encryption status. Moving to permissions, it will tell me whether or not a password has been set up for this device. And last but not least, we have the ability to reboot or restore our factory defaults. So since there's not much more I can do at this point, we're going to return to Designer. Before we do that, we should always open up Update Utility and make certain that we are running the current firmware for all of the products that we're going to begin to work with. So I'll minimize that. Before we get to adding these online devices to a project, few things to note. So you'll see this green bar on the left-hand side of these devices. That is indicating that these devices are online. You'll also see at the top of this box where our online devices are listed, we have an option to add devices by IP. This is so that you can add devices that are cross-subnet. So you can manually type in an IP address, Or you can use this add from file functionality where you essentially create in advance an Excel file with all of your IP addresses and then import that into Designer. Additionally, you have the ability to sort by IP scope. That's to the right of that add by IP functionality. So if you're an integrator or an end user who has hundreds of devices, you can really easily come in here and kind of sort through the devices that you're working with. The search field at the top allows you to filter your list. So if I type MXA, you'll see that that filters the list down to the MXA 310 and 910 for me. There's also a drop-down arrow to the right of the search tab where I can select a specific model number, and I can also filter that list by whether or not it has been automatically discovered by Designer, or if I have had to add that IP address manually. So those are the two options to then filter out that online device list. I'll reset that so that we can see everything. And at this point, we're going to close out of the online device tab, and we're going to head back to our projects tab. We'll double click to open our project, double click to open our location, and I'm going to maximize this screen. So this should look familiar to everyone. If I move to the coverage map tab, that's exactly the room layout we imported and the lobe design. Last but not least, here on the signal flow tab, we have all of our routes established through Designer. So the next step would be to move from virtual devices to online devices. So to access the devices that Designer is seeing, I will click Live Mode, which is right above the virtual devices. You'll see automatically that Designer populates a green bar at the top of my screen. You'll also see that Live Mode is now indicated with a green background. This is indicating that any changes I make will now be to devices that are online. Also, virtual devices now is replaced with the online devices, and those are the 4 devices that Designer has found on my network. We still have this same workspace in the middle of the screen, which are the devices that we manually added as virtual devices to our design. And the next step would be to associate our online devices with our virtual devices from the design. To do so, I'm going to select my IMX room, and I'm simply going to click it. And as I drag this over into my workspace, you'll see that the IMX room 101 turns a darker color, and that indicates that I can drop that device there to associate it with the online device. So I'm going to do that. I'm simply going to let go of my mouse, and you'll see that I now have a green indication on this device, and I have thus associated an online device with my offline design. I'll do the same for the MXA 910, simply drag it over and associate those devices. One thing to note, if you have multiples of the same device, you can identify them, so I can click identify and that device will flash so that I can be certain that I'm adding the proper device to my design. At this point, we have 2 online devices in our design, and you'll see we have IP address information, model number, firmware version automatically pulled in. You'll also see that our sync status is off. So essentially, we have not yet synchronized our offline design with our online devices. To showcase this, I'm going to open up the interface for the MXA 910 by double-clicking that device. And you'll see here that we have 8 lobes. We have all of our default settings for the MXA 910. For this particular project, we need only 5 lobes, if you recall. So in order to push our design to these online devices, I'm going to move to the synchronize section, which is at the top of those devices. And if I click on that drop-down arrow, I have the option to push that design to my online devices. So I will push, and Designer's going to ask me if I want to also push my Dante routes. At this point, I think that's a great idea, so I'm going to click push. And again, we're taking our design because those devices were factory default, and we are pushing that design to those devices. And this should be complete in about a second, and you'll see that it is successfully pushed to the devices. I can push again, but I'm just going to click done. Designer will prompt me to set up a password. We'll talk about, presets. We'll talk about presets in a minute. And I'm just going to click dismiss. So at this point, again, if I open up the interface for the MXA910 by double clicking it, you'll see that I have my 5 lobes. So we've successfully, again, pushed that design to those devices that are online. If I move through the tabs at the top here, you'll see at the coverage map tab, again, we have all of that information still retained. Moving to the signal flow tab, you will see that my routes are established. I have a green check mark in terms of my Dante routes, and the green indication at the top of the devices, again, indicating that those devices are online. So I'll head back to my overview tab. One more thing, I'm going to double click and open up the interface for IMX Room. So at this point, you'll see that on channels 1 through 5 on our mic inputs, we have that audio flowing from our MXA910. You'll also see that there is nothing happening on the output side. So we have this sort of stop sign warning. This is because we have not yet licensed IntelliMix Room. So I'm going to close out of this box, and you'll see that same message here at the top of this overview tab above the workspace. I'm going to click Go to Licenses to activate this instance of IntelliMix Room. And a new window will populate that's going to tell me that I need a license to pass audio. That's great, so I'll click Next. The next window will populate telling me that during activation, we need to connect to the remote license server. Essentially, you do need internet access in order to activate your license. I'm going to click Done. Great, so now what do? I need to select my IntelliMix Room instance by clicking the box to the left of that device. As soon as I do that, you'll see the Activate button turns a darker blue, and I can click Activate, and I'm prompted with a window to enter my license ID. I'm going to copy that ID from my file, essentially the email I received from Shure. And at this point, I just want to highlight, if you have one too many spaces in here, maybe you copy one too many spaces, Designer will not let you continue with licensing that particular instance of IMX Room. So you definitely have to have just those 12 characters as is on that particular email that you receive. I will also agree to the end user license agreement. And once I do that, I can click Activate. Now a window will populate that's telling me that an internet connection is going to be established so that I can activate that particular instance of IMX Room. I'll click OK through that message. And now you'll see that I have fully 16 channels licensed with an expiration date of 2023. This is great. So I'm going to head back to my project. At this point, again, that warning is gone. If I, again, open up that browser by double-clicking on IMX Room, you'll see that I have audio flowing from my input to my output side. And now I'm going to steal the screen from myself. So you'll now see the screen of my Nook. And you'll see here I have selected IMX Room for my microphone and speaker. I will unmute quickly so that you can hear myself through the MXA910 behind me. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. So very quickly, sorry for the feedback, we have designed a project and deployed that to live devices. A few other things before we finish today. I would like to go back to Designer and start talking through a few other important notes. So, if we return to this overview page in our live project, you could imagine that there would be need for some adjustments to happen on the Shure hardware. So I might need to go into my IMX Room and make adjustments to maybe my AEC, my noise reduction, etc. As soon as I make changes to those devices, that online device is out of sync with my design. So before you continue, at the end of a configuration, a commissioning, it's always recommended to pull back the changes on the devices to the design. So basically what I'm doing now is I am taking back the changes on the devices that I've just done in real time, and I'm syncing them with the design. So as soon as I do that, it tends to be pretty quick. I can then return to Designer on the Projects tab, and again, we have that export functionality. So this might be where you would want to export that documentation from Designer when you're completely done with your project so that you can memorialize all of the changes and all of the things that you did in that particular project. One other thing to note with regards to devices is presets. So at the top of this bar here, right under the green bar, you'll see the presets ribbon. Presets do not push as part of the synchronized process. So anytime you need to save a preset, you need to select the preset ribbon, choose your preset slot, and then enter the name. As soon as I save a preset, that same preset name and slot is saved on all devices in that particular location. Again, so if I open up the MXA910 interface by double-clicking, and if I move to the presets ribbon, again at the top right-hand side of my screen, you'll see that I just pushed that default preset to the MXA910 on preset slot 2. The same would be true of IMX Room. So again, two things to note. Presets are not pushed as part of this synchronized status, and presets must be made to all devices that are shared in that particular location. One additional thing to note here in this tab, we have audio encryption and we have password information. If I'd like to encrypt the audio in this particular project, I can select this drop-down box and I can enable encryption. Encryption can be auto-generated, or I can manually enter a passphrase of my choosing between 8 and 64 characters. For simplicity's sake, we're going to auto-generate. And I will simply click Enable. And at this point, Designer has encrypted this location, again, encrypted all devices in this location, and then Designer is going to continue with the security theme and prompt me to enter a password for this location. A note about passwords. If you do not have this password, you cannot continue along in Designer, should you need to come back to this particular design, or should you need to open up the browser interface. There's no backdoor really to getting into passwords. If you did not have that password and you walked into a job site, you would need to factory reset your gear in order to continue. So keep in mind that one caveat with regards to passwords. I will continue without password, and I'm going to move to the Signal Flow tab so we can talk through what encryption does. So you'll see that I now have a key icon on my Shure devices in this location. Encryption essentially fences the audio routes between the devices in that location. So if I open up Dante Controller, you'll see here I have channels 1 through 8 of my MXA910 routed to IMX Room. I can easily remove any of those routes between those devices, either through Designer or through Dante Controller. But I cannot, for example, come into Dante Controller and select this MXA310 and start routing audio. So the only routes open to me are the devices that share that same encryption key. One other thing to note, you can, of course, reestablish routes in Designer or in Dante Controller, and that communication is essentially bidirectional. So at this point, we've added encryption to this project. We've talked through passwords. The last thing to talk about is templates. So templates are an easy way that you can duplicate your efforts and reuse your designs for different locations. So I cannot copy this location into a new location, but I can create a template from this design. We're going to call this template Room Type A. And in Room Type A, we're going to have an MXA910 and an IMX room. And I'm just going to click Create. At this point, Designer will open up a new window with the devices that we've already added to this project, the same exact conference room image and MXA 910 layout, as well as the same audio routes and optimization that has been done previously. So at this point, I can either come into my Templates tab in the future and open up a new project, create a new project, or if I go back to that template, I can immediately create a new location from that template. So if this is room 202, for example, and it shares all of the same Shure gear, I can create a room, and again, it pulls in all of that information. And at this point, what I would want to do is jump into live mode and begin associating those devices and synchronize the design. But what we've done thus far is we've taken the design from room 101, copied that into a template, and then deployed that to a new room type. So if I open up Niles Campus, you'll see I have 2 rooms. The second way that you can create a template that you can then use to duplicate across other locations is on the My Templates tab. So if I open up a new template, and we're going to call this room type B, and we're going to put a 310 in here, and let's put in a P300. I can create a new template and begin designing from scratch. So I would simply drag the devices I'd like to work with into this template. At this time, there's nothing to add for the coverage map for the MXA 310, so I'll continue to the Signal Flow tab. And I'm just going to route my audio between these devices. It's quick. I'll optimize my audio, and I will then be simply finished with this particular design. I did want to talk really briefly about certification for MuteSync. So if you need to enable MuteSync, you would want to open up, obviously, your processor and enable your logic. We should be talking about MuteSync status with Zoom, Teams, for example, and that is the one way that we can kind of bring that into the conversation. So again, I've just created that second template. I can immediately create a location from the template on this page, or I can simply save it and use that particular template for basically in the future. So again, 2 different ways that we can create those templates within Designer. So at this point, I will open up the line to any questions. We have talked through the workflow in terms of designing a project with devices that are virtual. We have then taken that design and deployed that to online devices. We've also talked through a few other topics as it relates to Designer. We've talked about templates, we've talked about presets, we've talked about encryption and passwords, and we've also just touched on that, that Zoom Teams certification for MuteSync.